The New Deal, Part 1. Yes, there is a Part 2, which tells you something about how important the New Deal is in American history. Perhaps you are familiar with the phrase, the Green New Deal. And this title was chosen deliberately because it looks back to this time in American history when American government was dramatically changed. And so the Green New Deal that is being touted as at least a potential aspect of the Democratic nominee's platform, depends on who's elected here, or who's selected by the Democrats, but the Green New Deal then would change America dramatically in terms of how government relates to programs and their impact on the environment. Okay? Whereas the original New Deal was to have a significant impact on how the government related to business and economics and so forth. So, the term New Deal then is absolutely essential to understand American history, even if it hadn't been for the, quote, Green New Deal, okay? The campaign of 1932. Herbert Hoover had served as President of the United States for the first 3 years of the Great Depression. Just flat unlucky. I suspect Herbert Hoover would have been a fine to great president had it not been that he inherited the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, in my opinion, was coming regardless of who was president. It was just going to come together at about that time. As the chill of fall 1932 added its bite to that of the Depression, the presidential campaign entered its final days. Hoover was the butt of jokes wherever he went on the campaign trail. Everywhere you saw banners, "In Hoover we trusted, now we are busted." Nevertheless, he hammered home the message that the only safe course, the only way out of the Great Depression was the Republican path of balanced budgets and individual American responsibility for their own economic well-being. That's the way it had always been, and Hoover said that's the way it should be. Hoover warned that his opponents' policies were socialistic and un-American. He said Roosevelt's policies would destroy the very foundation of our American system. Pursue them, he said, and grass will grow in the streets of 1,000 cities and towns. Economic collapse, not just depression, if you choose Franklin Roosevelt's path. Nevertheless, the Depression continued. You need to understand now that in 1932, the Depression has lasted for 3 years. Things continue to get worse, and there is no end in sight. Franklin Roosevelt, in spite of his handicap, he could not walk without the assistance of braces on his legs and crutches. In spite of this handicap, he seemed the more energetic man, the more vital man. He promised the American people a new deal. He believed the federal government, here's the key to the New Deal, he believed the federal government ought to assume responsibility for individual Americans where state and local aid had failed. See, the states were all bankrupt or out of money. Local cities and towns out of money. Only the federal government can print money. And so Roosevelt hinted at plans to regulate the economy and to put people to work on federal government projects. Put them to work for the government. However, Hoover was wrong. Franklin Roosevelt was not a socialist. It was not his purpose to do away with capitalism, the capitalist system. It was his purpose to modify it and to save it through reforms. He was fond of saying that what the country needed was bold experimentation. What we're doing is not working. That was pretty clear. We need to experiment with some new solutions to our economic problems. Above all, he said, try something. Let's not be a slave to our philosophy. In other words, FDR was prepared to try new ideas until he found something that worked. But it had to be, for Roosevelt, it had to be something within the democratic capitalist system. Hoover was locked into his conservative philosophy, his conservative ideology. And he would not allow the federal government, as long as he was president, to help individual Americans. Symbolic of Roosevelt's pragmatism, his find something that works mentality, was his quarterback analogy. He used the quarterback analogy to explain what he was going to do with the New Deal. And in those days, quarterbacks on the football team, they called the plays. There was none of this sending in a play from the coach. It was the quarterback's job. It was the glory days of football. And the quarterback analogy was this. The quarterback in a football game calls a play, and if the play works, then he calls similar plays, or he runs the same play over and over again. In other words, he reinforces success. And if the play doesn't work, well, he's not going to call it again. So you forget that play and move on to something else. The quarterback analogy was how Roosevelt explained to the American people what he was going to do with the New Deal. We're going to call some new plays, some new programs. If they work, we'll do more. If they don't, we'll try something else. That just seemed to be absolute common sense to the average American. And that is also a great example of how Roosevelt could communicate to the average American. It was on their level. They got it. Indeed, what moved Franklin Roosevelt most of all was not ideology either of the left or of the right, but compassion. Compassion for his fellow human being. No one who knew him well would ever ask, in the words of Shakespeare, "Are you like the painting of a sorrow? A face without a heart?" Well, what do I mean? Roosevelt was not a socialist. Time out. Hopefully you're aware that even today, conservative historians and economists, in trying to explain why we are where we are in American history in terms of our government and its relationship to the average American and what it does and so forth, they look back to Franklin Roosevelt and they say the New Deal was where America became a socialist welfare state. And so they're not admiring of Franklin Roosevelt in the least. Conservatives, they see this as a huge mistake. This is some path. Hoover was right as far as they're concerned. This was when America became something else, and it wasn't good. Okay? Whereas liberals look back to this period of time, and they say, well, this is when America really entered into the modern period, and we begin to become what we are today. And with some credit, of course, to Woodrow Wilson and the progressive movement. But for liberals today, Franklin Roosevelt is a hero. And he initiated this modern movement into the welfare state. So you need to understand that. It helps you decide what you think today. Now, it is possible that Roosevelt did what modern liberals say he did, but it may be that other developments since that time have actually created the welfare state. And Roosevelt really wasn't intending to do that. Okay, so complicated, right? But you need to understand the terminology. What do I mean by Roosevelt was not a socialist? Because there were many socialists and communists in the country at that time, and they absolutely hated Franklin Roosevelt. Many socialist and communist Americans believed that Roosevelt was far too conservative that his policies were essentially obsolete, that what the American people needed was truly socialism, where the government owns and operates the major businesses and utilities and so forth. That is not what Franklin Roosevelt was proposing. They believed that Roosevelt was proposing a Band-Aid on a heart attack. They believed, the socialists believed, that American capitalism was not only dead, but it was evil. Why would you want to go back to that? Roosevelt's trying to save it. They hated him. Conservatives hated him too. But the vast majority of the American people are in the middle of this political spectrum, and they thought Roosevelt made sense. There were, as I said, socialists in America, and the Socialist Party is not illegal. Not illegal then, not illegal now. Socialist Norman Thomas received over 800,000 votes in the 1932 election. People for whom Franklin Roosevelt was not liberal enough. But though the American people were ready to try new solutions, they did not yet want socialism. They wanted to give FDR a chance to save the democratic capitalist system. Reforms, yes. Socialism, no. And so Roosevelt easily defeated Herbert Hoover in 1932. You go into a presidential election with the economy in shambles, you are not going to get reelected. Okay? You go into a presidential election with the economy at all-time highs in many different ways, you're really going to have to screw up to get defeated. Okay? So there you go. Bill Clinton taught us this in the 1990s. In 1992, he told his staff, because they tended to get sidetracked, he told his own staff, it's the economy, stupid. Now that's his people. Don't forget this, it's the economy. It's the economy. Now that may change someday, but we haven't seen it yet. And so the American people wanted to give Franklin Roosevelt a chance. They did. They elected him in what was called a landslide, which means a total butt kicking. It's not close. But if the economy had not improved by 1936 in 4 years, you can bet that the socialists would have gotten a whole lot more votes than they did in 1932. Men had to have jobs. Women had to have homes. Children had to have enough to eat. Above all, Americans needed hope. Fixing the banks. If the banks are broken in the capitalist system is broken. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, the country was in the midst of a banking crisis. People were losing their savings as banks went bankrupt. For in those days, no one's savings were insured. The only guarantee you had regarding your savings in a bank was the financial strength of that bank. If that bank went out of business, you took your savings with it. And most banks by 1933 were very weak indeed. Franklin Roosevelt responded to the banking crisis by giving the banks a holiday. Note the use of the terminology here. And Roosevelt, and again, both sides of the political spectrum agree with this, he is a master communicator. When we get to the 1980s and Ronald Reagan is president of the United States, both sides are going to agree he's a master communicator. Right? The choice of the word holiday was crucial. It's all about psychology. I'm going to give the banks a holiday. All the banks are closing, folks. That would normally signal what? Massive crisis, right? Yeah. But it's a holiday. No worries. Went on the radio. Hoover hated the radio and didn't know how to use it. Franklin Roosevelt was a master of communicating to the American people over the airwaves. The radio is a relatively new technology. And he explained to the American people what he was doing, giving the holiday. Going to give us a chance to shore up the banks by providing more funds for these banks, okay? But Roosevelt, again, knew that psychology was everything. He could put money behind the banks, but if nothing changed in terms of psychology, that money would soon be exhausted, and you'd be right back where you were. So he had to change the psychology of the American people. And this is something that has changed from that generation to where we are. Today, politicians, the last thing they want to do is ask the American people to do anything, to sacrifice it, right? Franklin Roosevelt went on the radio and said, "My fellow Americans, I need you to help." He said, "I need you to have faith in your neighbors, have faith in your friends, have faith in your fellow Americans, have faith in your government. And when the banks open up again in a few days, I need you to do something. Don't run to the banks and take your money out. Rather, take the money that you've already taken out or the money that you've saved underneath that mattress and go to the banks and, having faith in your fellow Americans, put the money back in the banks." And amazingly, that's what the American people did. Now, did some people run to the banks and get their? Yes, absolutely. But the vast majority did not. They put the money back in. And Roosevelt then had bought himself time, bought the government time, bought the American people time. And so that summer, the Congress passed in those first 100 days. And that phrase, 100 days, is an allusion to this period of time when so many important changes were made in 100 days. Last night in the Democratic debate in Las Vegas, Joe Biden referenced, "In the first 100 days of my administration." To older Americans, he was saying, like the New Deal. See? And so in that summer of 1933, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act was passed. Part of that Banking Act was the creation of the FDIC. And every time you walk into the bank, and I know that Americans don't walk into the bank anymore, but if you did, you would see on the door, "Protected by FDIC." And it says right there on that little badge on the door that your savings deposit, your checking deposit, is protected by who? FDIC, okay, which is the federal government, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, I don't know what the limit is now, $500,000 or something like that. By the way, this financial advice is free. If you've got more than $500,000 in a single account, after class, I want you to go to your bank and take out that amount that's over $500,000 and put it in a different bank, because it's not protected. I think it's 500. It might be $1 million today. So I realize that, well, probably most of you don't have over 500,000. But in case you did, there you go. Don't tell me that I never gave you any good financial advice. So that's why now you don't have to worry. Your parents don't have to worry about losing their money in a bank run. Now, we did have bank closings in the Great Recession. And it was at this point that the FDIC actually started kicking out checks. Just within your lifetime. And so FDR then had averted, for a time, the banking crisis. The other problem, or another major problem, was, of course, the farm crisis. The farm crisis that had been brewing for a decade. Fixing the farm problem was one of the first things that FDR wanted to do. The basic problem on America's farms is that they don't grow enough. Right? No, that's not the problem, folks. Yeah, the problem is they grow too much. They're too good at what they do. So you've got a massive supply, which means you've got what kind of prices? Terribly low, and the farmers can't make a living off those low prices. We explained this already the other day. How do you reduce the supply and raise the price? If farmers could have done that by themselves, they would have done it by now, right? 10 years? Sure. So to solve the overproduction problem, Congress passed the AAA. This is easy. And you do have to do a little bit of work here remembering these acronyms, the alphabet soup agencies, so to speak. The AAA is easy. Agriculture. Adjustment. That's what we need is adjustment, right? And of course, A almost always stands for administration. Agriculture, adjustment, administration. It's a federal program, a new play. And the basic idea behind the AAA was to pay farmers a certain amount to do what? Work harder? To work less. Okay, so you were planting 100 acres. Now your allotment is 80 acres, but we'll give you a little check to make up the difference. Okay? Does that sound American to you? It didn't sound American to Americans at that time. You're going to pay me not to work? See? And for an entire to this day, that doesn't sound really American. You get paid for work, right? You don't get paid not to work. Okay. Well, that's AAA, though. That is going to work, folks. But it's different because it's the federal government coordinating with farmers to say, okay, this is what you plant, and this is how much of it you plant, and all across the country, AAA. Farmers can say, hey, we're not participating. Don't have to. But the vast majority of farmers are so desperate that it's going to work. Just help me. FDR firmly believed that if he could solve the farm problem, he was halfway home to returning America to prosperity. Because farmers at that time were almost 40% of the country. Fixing business. You got banks, you got farmers, you're going to have business. This all makes sense. That's the way to think of it. American business and industry were also hurting. So Roosevelt has a plan, a play, to revive business known as the National Recovery Administration, NRA. And not to be confused with the gun organization, okay, NRA, National Rifle Association. So, National Recovery Administration, okay? And it's to help businesses get out of the Great Depression. What's it going to do? Well, we're producing too much, just like the farmers were producing too much. So we got to limit production somehow, raise prices. So it's the same problem. We'd like to raise wages a little bit so the employees have more purchasing power. So the NRA allows and encourages labor to form unions with government support. And of course, unions are going to ask for more money. But it also is intending to limit production and control prices. What does that sound like? The government deciding that you're going to produce so much, you're going to charge so much, you're going to pay so much? What is that? Don't be afraid. Well, careful, okay? We have to distinguish between socialism and communism, all right? The government wouldn't be setting any of these things with private ownership if it was communist because there wouldn't be any private ownership, okay? It would just be government run, you see. All right, but it sounds like socialism, doesn't it? Because in a socialist economy, you still have privately owned businesses. You also have government-owned businesses as well, okay? Usually utilities and so forth. But you still have privately owned businesses. But now the government is going to be involved in setting prices and such. That is socialism. Well, how come I said that Roosevelt was not a socialist? Am I contradicting myself already? He's right up to the brink of the socialist chasm, folks. Why is it not socialism? It's voluntary. You don't have to do this, right? You can sign up and you can become part of the NRA, and the NRA will help you regulate your industry and so forth, and you'll get to put a blue eagle on your business, which means you are participating But if you don't have a Blue Eagle, that means you're not participating. See? And so there was a lot of a stigma associated with either having or not having the Blue Eagle. See? But it's voluntary, so it's not social. But the whole idea here is that we're going to produce less, prices are going to go up, we're going to have labor unions, and working men and women are going to get more money, and the government's going to be involved in this. But participation in NRA had to be voluntary. Now, you have true socialism, it's not going to be voluntary, okay? The government is going to take over this or that part of the economy. I'm not stretching anyone's truth or imagination to say that Bernie Sanders today, just so you understand, all right, calls himself a democratic socialist. He's proud of it. And if he's elected president and he has a Congress that's willing to do this, then his plan, as he says it today, is to take over the healthcare industry. So that would be to nationalize all healthcare. There wouldn't be any private healthcare insurance companies or pharmaceuticals or anything like that. All right? So that's socialism. It's not taking over the entire economy, but the healthcare industry is about 20% of the American economy. See? So there's the difference. You make up your own minds as to what you think about this. But the correlation between the 1930s and the New Deal and the modern moment is very direct. Well, NRA didn't work real well. Farmers generally cooperated with AAA. Again, desperation. But business people, some cooperated, some didn't. Some said they were cooperating and then didn't, right? Cheated. And so NRA is a disaster, and Maclay goes into some detail as to the disaster that NRA was. It did not work. And then the Supreme Court came along and declared it unconstitutional anyway. So NRA's history. Okay. An example of a failure of a New Deal program. Fixing unemployment. Many Americans by the spring of 1933, just as FDR took office, didn't own farms or have businesses or even have jobs by now. 17 million people were out of work. We don't know what the percentage is. 25%, 30% unemployment. That's the Great Depression. And just because you have a job doesn't mean you think you're going to have a job next month or next year. Okay? And just because you lost your job doesn't mean you stayed unemployed throughout the entire Depression, right? The situation is that the vast majority of the American people are scared to death, whether they have a job or not. And that's part of the problem. You got 17 million unemployed in the summer of 1933. For these people, FDR would have to find some way to help them and do it fast. Thus, just 2 weeks after taking office, he called for unemployment relief for individual Americans. Unemployment relief. This was what Herbert Hoover would not do. Herbert Hoover would not send a federal unemployment relief check to individual Americans. Okay? Franklin Roosevelt is going to do that. So just 2 weeks after taking office, Roosevelt begins a number of programs that will last throughout the Great Depression and into the 1940s. The most successful of these programs were the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the PWA, the Public Works Administration. Okay? Again, there's that A, administration. CCC. Even in my lifetime, in the 1970s, and we're in the midst of a recession in the 1970s, just as I was getting into the workforce, there were politicians calling for a return of the CCC. Okay? 40 years after. The CCC was a government program run by the United States Army that took young men, boys in many cases, out of the cities and took them out into the countryside where the first thing they did was build their barracks, their encampments and so forth, places to sleep and to have meals and such. and latrines. And then they put them to work, unskilled labor, doing jobs that anyone could do. Here's a rake, here's an axe, here's a shovel. So you can work on trails in state parks. You can clean. You can do all kinds of work, all right? In Oregon, the CCC boys went up on Mount Hood and they helped build Timberline Lodge. But the thing was that these young men were running the streets before the CCC. They were getting into trouble. There was crime, and people were worried about just walking the streets. And so this program took them off the streets, took them out into the countryside, gave them a place to stay, gave them 3 meals a day. There were army doctors there for them. And many of them had never seen a doctor before. There were dentists, and even more had never seen a dentist before. And they had something to do. And they did learn rudimentary skills. And this program goes on throughout the 30s. And the Army was more than willing to do it because the Army was being cut all this time because there's not enough money. And so now the Army could run the program and could say, we're contributing, don't cut us anymore. CCC. Almost all Americans who remember this program have a favorable view of CCC. And then there's PWA, Public Works. Just what it says. It's a federal government works program. But this is not unskilled labor. Now, the Public Works, PWA, is for skilled labor, engineers, heavy equipment operators, and so forth. And these guys are going to build buildings. They're going to build hospitals. They're going to build schools. They're going to build roads. And in the 1930s, most importantly, they're going to build the great dams of the West. Grand Coulee, Bonneville. If it hadn't been for those dams and the power that they produced, the American people would have been in a very difficult situation during World War II. And the economy would not have continued to grow after World War II without the power it needed to do that. PWA. And just to make one more connection here, PWA was absolutely crucial. It's Grand Coulee is a PWA project there in central Washington. So it puts thousands of men to work. Families moved there. In fact, my wife's grandfather worked on Grand Coulee Dam. My wife's father was born there and grew up there in Grand Coulee, Washington. And my wife's father worked a heavy steam shovel his entire life, heavy equipment operator. PWA. What I was going to say, where I was sidetracked into a little family history, was that Grand Coulee was responsible for the power that brought some of the nuclear testing facilities to Hanford. And so it's crucial then in the creation of the atomic bomb. Nuclear power. So these projects, CCC, PWA, and dozens of others that I could describe, were crucial then in giving the American people hope. For many Americans, they gave jobs, but for all Americans, they could see around them that there was somebody in the White House who cared, who was willing to try new plays, new programs, to help literally dig the American people out of the Great Depression. There were New Deal programs for home mortgages, arts projects, irrigation and dam projects, new schools, new libraries. You name it, the New Deal did it. There was even a New Deal program that sent unemployed historians into the libraries to organize the archives of libraries and stuff. I mean, what do you do with an historian anyway? Right? What do you do with an academic, a college professor? You hand them a shovel, you know what they do? They write a paper about how to use a shovel. I think that's as funny as I get. You can't let them starve, can you? Right. Perhaps the most relevant New Deal project as far as you are concerned, as far as your parents and grandparents are concerned, is Social Security. We have Social Security Day because of Franklin Roosevelt. It's created in 1935, right in the middle of the Great Depression. Social Security is the government-run retirement program which every American must contribute to. You get a paycheck, you have to have some of your money taken out and put into Social Security. And your employer has to match those funds so that when you retire, and you guys are going to be 90, the age retirement goes up a little bit because of the life expectancy and because they're trying to make the Social Security program viable, economically viable. And so it goes up a little bit, okay? Every so often. But right now, Social Security is the only income for millions of Americans. They live comfortably or not based on that Social Security check, okay? And this is going to be a major bone of contention in the presidential election here this year. Social Security, and what to do about it, how to make it more economically viable. Assessing the New Deal. By 1936, 3 years into the New Deal now, and 6 or 7 years, depending on how you count it, into the Great Depression, the American economy was clearly improving. Now, that doesn't mean that the conservatives in the country are going to go, oh, we were wrong. Franklin Roosevelt was right. That is not human nature. Sometimes human beings will change their minds, but not usually. Usually if you point out to somebody that they're wrong about something, they entrench, don't they? They become defensive, angry. Emotions take over. This is why I said the other day, in something of an exaggeration, but still a truism, that philosophy is impervious to the facts. And it doesn't matter which human being or which philosophy we're talking. You know that, though, you can force yourself to be a little less impervious to the facts, right? Yeah. This is supposed to be one of the benefits of a liberal arts education, college education. Well, conservatives didn't say, oh yeah, we were wrong, sorry about that, we're now going to vote for Roosevelt. They said, Roosevelt's New Deal actually retarded or impeded the recovery that was coming anyway. If Roosevelt hadn't gotten himself involved with the federal government, we would have gotten out of the Depression faster. They said the same thing during Barack Obama's 8 years. Okay? Same thing. Same argument. If you hadn't done this, you hadn't done that, Obamacare, we would have recovered more quickly. They might be right. But that's not the history. History is you got to have facts, okay? And you can't have facts from something that did not happen. Now again, I'm not saying absolutely no way are they right. I'm saying they might be right. But that's not what the historian can say. All right? The historian can only say what happened. But I want you to understand the context. So conservatives said the New Deal actually impeded the recovery. It would have been better and faster had it not been for the New Deal. But it seems to me, historian that I am, that the recovery that came was clearly the result of two things. Most New Deal programs worked. Most did. Especially AAA. More about that in the next lecture. Especially PWA. It built the buildings. There they are. And even more especially, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. And then, of course, the banking legislation was so crucial. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banking from investment banking, all right? Commercial banking, that's your bank. Key Bank, U.S. Bank, things like that. Investment banking back in those days, now that's J.P. Morgan and the great brokerage houses and so forth, Goldman Sachs, right? And so it separated these two kinds of bankings. You can't have both banks underneath the same ownership, right? And the idea of that was to make the American banking industry more solid, less likely to collapse. In their great wisdom in the late 1990s, the American people then decided in Congress to eliminate that aspect of Glass-Steagall and to make it possible to have commercial and investment banking under the same roof. Again, after 60 years of relative stability. Guess what happened? Within 10 years, you get the great banking collapse that we call the Great Recession. Yeah. Philosophy is impervious to the facts. So, it seems to me the recovery was in place because of the New Deal. That's what the facts say. Secondly, FDR had given the American people hope for a better future. What's the title of your text? Land of Hope. And so Franklin Roosevelt had restored hope to the American people. He had rekindled their faith in themselves and their country. Thus, the New Deal was a turning point, catch my phrase here, a turning point in the psychology of the American people. Okay? Before the New Deal, the federal government did not recognize responsibility for the well-being of the average American. Americans were to take care of themselves as they always had. Franklin Roosevelt recognized that the whole world had changed. The economies of nations were linked together as never before. You have a world economy. And a single man could not control his own destiny anymore. Even out on the farm, your farm is linked, your prices you get for your produce are linked to the world economy. 100 years before this, you could just go out and work harder, make more money. It was possible in the 1830s, 1840s. Not anymore. A man could not save himself in the midst of the Great Depression, most of the time. And so the government had to help by assisting the economy and by assisting individual men and women. This last assistance, assisting the average American, seemed to many Americans then and now to be a break with the American past of individual responsibility. But the New Deal did not mark, in my opinion, a radical break with the American past. I'm saying that that's not the correct interpretation. Do they have some points here? Yes, they do. There's a change here. But I think the better way to look at it is that the New Deal is another stage of development in American history. That the New Deal was another era in a long line of eras of American reform. These eras of reform all had one thing in common: the attempt on the part of the American people through the use of their federal government to create a more egalitarian society. The Founding Fathers attempted to use a new government to separate themselves from British tyranny. More equality, more freedom. Jefferson and Jackson attempted to complete the American experiment, to bring it to more Americans. Lincoln sought to redeem that experiment, to save the Union, and then add equality, or at least freedom, to another significant part of the American people: black slave. And this was a dramatic use of the federal government. All those Union soldiers are federal employees. Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson sought to recapture that egalitarian and more free period of time during the progressive movement. And how did they do it? By the use of the federal government, you see. And FDR, in the midst of the Great Depression, sought to save the democratic capitalist system. All of them hoped to make America the land of opportunity for all, not just the rich. All of them used the federal government in one way or another to accomplish that goal. So in my opinion, and again, an opinion, the New Deal fell within the American political tradition. Roosevelt brought to office a firm faith in the basic principles of the American political system. What he wanted was for industry and agriculture to organize in order to become more efficient, to produce the right amount of goods at a fair price, but still a low price. He also wanted labor to unionize so that it would be strong enough to command decent wages. The government's role was to assist these three entities in achieving success. In short, Franklin Roosevelt, in a vastly changed world, sought to save the capitalist system, not destroy it. Questions? Okay. God bless you all.